when your speech is done, okay? Your time is done. Finish your sentence.
Everyone ready? My time starts now.
With a
The resolution on balance refugee restrictions in developed countries are permissible. First definition. Refugee restrictions means laws and sanctions applying to refugees but not applying to immigrants and legal citizens within a developed country. Framework. If a country's action could fulfill the moral obligations to other people and doesn't harm the national interest, then it will be permissible. Contention 1. Social contract. According to J.W. Gong, the social contract arguments indicates that individuals have agreed, either directly or indirectly, to surrender some of their freedoms and submit to the authority in exchange for protection of their safety, welfare, and other rights. The government is therefore morally obligated to prioritize their own citizens and withhold the right to reject the interests of other people. The intake of refugees harms the citizens' right in the following two ways. A. Terrorism. According to Fox News, a Syrian refugee injured 15 people when he detonated a bomb outside the concert. An ISIS cell killed 130 in coordinated attacks across Paris. And its members traveled back and forth between Syria, concealing themselves between refugees. In Germany, more than half of teleclass have involved refugees since it opened up to refugees, and more than 1,000 had died in terrorist attacks involving refugees in a 4-year span. That's 100 local citizens' lives. And Merkel, who has been supportive of Germany's accepting large number of refugees, admits that terrorists have smuggled into Europe with refugees and has already regretted over the sudden huge intake of refugees. B. Domestic trade-offs. The money used to host refugees is directly tapped from the welfare budget, which are all aimed at helping domestic needy people. According to a massive study done by the Federation for the American Immigration Reform, refugees will cost up to $1.8 billion per year. Most of these cohort arrives here without financial resources and possessing few marketable job skills. According to Population Reference Bureau, the American low-income families have reached more than 10 million who are greatly in need of their welfare money. A country does have the right to prioritize these needy people living in abject poverty before the refugees, as these people are its citizens, while refugees are not. The country will make this debate a yes or no issue on whether accepting refugees is good or bad, but this is a false equivalency. We believe that countries may and should accept refugees, but only when it does not harm the rights of its own citizens. Only by applying restrictions can they responsibly maintain their obligation to their citizens and to the world. Contention 2, alternative option. The cost of resettling refugees in developed countries are much higher than resettling them in nearby countries. According to the American government, the money of resettling one refugee in the US is sufficient to resettle 12 refugees in the neighboring countries. What we are doing when taking one refugee into the developed country is taking away the opportunity of asylum for the 11 left. The 5-year cost of resettling about 39,000 Syrian refugees in the United States is enough to erase the current UNHCR funding gap of $2.5 billion for 4 million Syrian refugees. Judge, our side believes that giving aid and not resettling from the developed country will do more to alleviate the refugee crisis and save more lives. And according to Jacobson in 2018, the ultimate solution to the refugee problem is to change local conditions, including those of the camps. Oxford economist Paul Collier concurs, the fate of refugees does not really depend on whether a few thousand more come to the rich societies. What really matters is what happens to the thousands and millions. That's why these alternatives are significantly more efficient than accepting refugees. Moreover, letting refugees settle in camps closer to their countries of origin will save the danger of violence and trafficking they will face on their treacherous journey in developed countries. For all these reasons, we encourage a pro-ballot. Thank you.
On-site constructor for 4 minutes. Everyone can hear me?
Everyone ready? Time starts now. We oppose, because this topic uses words unbalanced and are. Protein must defend existing policy within the festival, including denial of entry, arbitrary detention, and the abusive use of border defense. Contention 1. Restriction is a humanitarian crime. The restriction presented by Pro can only result in 5 major bad consequences. They cannot win this debate unless they solve all of them. A. Denial of borders. Law enforcement officials use violence to illegally push refugees back and deny their access to asylum. Refugees are detained indefinitely and subjected to torture, beating, rape, and exploitation by border guards. B. Human trafficking. Quote the news. Restriction creates an environment where human trafficking and criminal networks flourish. Quote UNICEF. Children trafficking now accounts for more than 1/3 of all children refugees. Organ harvesting from kidnapped refugees is becoming a thriving business, undermining overall basic human rights and global security. C. Refugee camp disaster. According to EU, most refugees live off $0.5 per day in camps. Refugee camps present problems include overcrowding, inadequate water, food, and poor sanitation. In Syria, 85% of Iraq refugees have little or no access to health care. When millions of refugees arrive in a concentrated area, diseases like cholera and malaria break out quickly. More than 40,000 Hutu refugees already died from cholera, a European treatable disease in camps, which could provoke major outbreaks of disease in recipient area, which perfectly rebuts the idea of points mentioned in their constitution too. D. Hurt future generations. Says UNHCR. Only 23% of uneducated refugee children attend secondary school, compared to 84% globally, which further marginalizes refugee groups in recipient society while disrupt overall economy and security by producing more unskilled labor. E. For LGBTI. According to Betsy Fisher from International Refugee Assistance Project, in 2019, LGBTI refugees are particularly at risk of persecution, fearing harassment, as well as criminal consequences under current restrictions. Condition 2. Developed countries have multiple obligations. Subpoint A. War and destruction. The 5 wealthiest countries are now hosting less than 5% of the world's refugees, while developing countries host an incredible 86% of all refugees. The worst humanitarian crisis today in Yemen is fueled by US, along with NATO countries, who willingly support more than 60% of Saudi Arabia's arms sales used in Yemen war. According to UN News, December 17, 2018, European powers such as UK, France, Germany, and other developed countries in Africa have ruined these nations, leading to current problems in Sudan, Rwanda, and DRC. 90% of infrastructure has been destroyed over the conflict. Subpoint B. Climate refugees. According to the Center for Global Development, developed countries are responsible for 79% of historical carbon emissions, causing the rise of sea levels, intensifying droughts and other extreme weather events, and forcing thousands of refugees to flee developing countries in Africa, Asia, and South America. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned by 2050 there could be 150 million climate refugees worldwide. Effects of global warming are expected to impact developing countries more than developed countries, as most of them are more vulnerable in adapting their economic and social status facing climate change. Thus, developed countries are not only responsible for this, but also the only options those climate refugees can possibly have. Contention 3. Only developed countries can accept. Developing countries suffer from over-influx of refugees in status quo that exceeded its maximum capacity. According to UNHCR's latest annual Global Trends report, when developed countries shut their doors to refugees, more than 85% of refugees are located in developing countries, overstretching the system. The cost amounts to $14 billion in each country, exacerbating poverty and unemployment. Note, the refugees being rejected by our opponent's proposal will either turn into illegal refugees or flow into already over-intensive developing countries, directly turn our opponent's every single social impact to our ground. Judge, please note that throughout this entire debate, since the first priority of refugee is definitively survival and pursue a higher quality of life, regardless of restrictions, refugees will go to developed countries legally or illegally. Refugees being rejected will directly turn into increasing illegal refugees and therefore increase every single harm impact our opponents mentioned about terrorism as well as destabilizing social order into our ground. Further, as evidence from Canadian administration shows, that every single security problem our opponents mentioned could turn to our ground. Thank you. Cross.
Everyone? Yeah.
Time starts now. I believe I have the first question.
Yes, we do.
You mentioned in your first contention that 85% of refugees have no access to healthcare and they receive no education. Doesn't that exactly mean we should send social resource and social aid to them?
First of all, we're suggesting that current refugee camp disaster, which is the process is defending status quo. There are severe refugee camp disasters in which healthcare and education is lacked. And further, what our opponent is simply suggesting is social aid to stop all the problems easily. First, not only has the social aid causing problems of bureaucracy and corruption, and further, I would like to ask one question in response. Are you aware that at how much proportion has the UNHCR 2018 funding plan been met? In short, how much has UNHCR funding plan in 2018 has been paid by developed countries?
Not very much paid. So that's exactly why we are paying them. Instead of taking refugees into the developed countries, now our alternative plan is making the developed country pay those bills they were meant to bill.
Thank you. So our opponent is suggesting that we will make those developed countries pay.
Sorry. I believe it's now my turn to ask you a question.
May I have a follow-up?
No, thank you.
Your question, please.
You have said that you mentioned that in developing countries, refugees in camps do not have a higher quality. Doesn't that, and 85% of refugees are in developing countries, so isn't it more efficient to make the condition in the camp better?
Of course not. We're suggesting that those developed countries are overcrowded, that their social system cannot accommodate that all. It's not the problem of our resources. However, it's the problem of our social system. And when we see those developing countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey being destructed and collapsed, we will see more refugees in a vicious cycle that our opponent's proposal creates. Let me ask you.
Like you have said, it is because the money they receive is not enough, because the percentage is too low.
Thank you. So in the status quo, we have restrictions, right? But in the status quo, under such restriction, the developed countries are already unable to pay for the funding plan. How can we expect our opponent's utopian plan of making those countries pay without specifying the measures that they're going to take to make those countries?
We are defending the restriction. We are not defending all status quo. We are saying status quo is not good enough. But it is not good enough, not because of restriction. It is not good enough because the money is not enough for the developing countries.
Thank you. Then can you give me one specific measure of how you're going to force those developed countries to pay for their money?
Can you give me a specific method of how exactly the developed you are going to force the developed country to take in the refugees?
That is easy. We'll make them lift the border.
Then we can do that. We can have the same measures as you do. If you can force
so you're suggesting our opponents same measure as we do, which is lift the scrutiny. That's my process.
No, how we are going to force the developed country to take in refugees? We are going to force them to pay the money.
International pressure, as we already said. The point is that the aid foundation, the overall aid condition cannot be inspected easily. However, letting those refugees in or out is an easy situation to be monitored by international community like UNHCR. However, when countries are simply unable to pay the bill, you cannot force them because they have no money. Thank you.
Time starts now. As the second speaker for the pro team, I'm going to refute against the points provided by the con team in their constructive speech. The con team provided a total of 3 contentions. First, we're going to refute their definition. They said we have to defend the status quo, but that is not what the pro is obliged to do. The pro does not have to defend the status quo simply because the status quo is not good enough. In the status quo, there exists a severe refugee crisis, and it is not being solved effectively. If it is being solved, and the status quo is satisfied, we will not have this debate in the first place. And so, the aim both of our teams are trying to achieve is to solve the refugee crisis. But we're arguing that the refugee crisis can be solved even with refugee restrictions in developed countries. And the other team has to prove that refugee restrictions must not be imposed in developed countries in order to solve this refugee crisis. Now, move on to their contention 1. In their contention 1, they listed 5 problems that exist in the status quo. First, as I have just mentioned, we do not have to defend the status quo. Second, we have every reason to believe that they're exaggerating the situation. Judge, don't believe what they're describing. Most refugees are not in life and death scenarios. Not even the UNHCR is reporting along these lines anymore. According to Nayla Rush, recent data from the United Nations High Commissions for Refugees shows that for most refugees, resettlement is not a matter of life and death. When under scrutiny, misleading emotional appeals, such as ones portraying resettlement as a lifeline for especially vulnerable refugees, are less and less convincing. Judge, audience, it's time to view the refugee crisis rationally as a political issue, not as an emotional human rights claim on how we cannot watch the refugees die. And secondly, all these 5 issues above can be solved with our alternative option. Now let me elaborate on this contention of ours. We will give financial aid and social support to the developing countries that are nearby the countries that generated the refugees. And we have every reason to believe that this will help the situation. Not only financial aid, but also social aid has been given. Fund provided by the European Commission has assisted educational services in Lebanon. A group launched by Facebook currently has 30,000 members and has assisted people on many things, including school enrollment and reporting reviews. The WBG project is assisting on the revitalization of public infrastructure and had an immensely positive impact on Lebanon. We have every reason to believe that foreign aid is effective. And you have mentioned that human trafficking issues could arise. However, According to The Guardian, more than 15% of refugees traveling north through the Horn of Africa were trafficked during their journey. So if the refugees don't have to travel from their original country to developed countries, they won't suffer from the same issues. They won't suffer from human traffickers abusing their human rights, which is why we believe our alternative option is more effective and safer. Their second contention is that developing countries are hosting a lot of refugees and that developed countries are responsible. They stated that USA, UK, France all took part in wars that happened in developing countries. But it is irrational and irresponsible to only blame developed countries for the war that takes place in developing countries. The Israel-Pakistan war starts from the historical and cultural conflicts between the two countries. The war between Iraq and Iran is a result of the conflicts over an area. The Syrian refugee crisis is also caused by dictatorship domestically, and Saudi Arabia is also involved. So, developed countries as well as developing countries are involved in this crisis. And the climate refugee issue only will happen after 2050, while they said we should focus on the status quo. They're contradicting with each other when bringing up the climate refugee issue. And finally, they mentioned that only developed countries are capable of dealing with the refugees. They are right that developed countries are developed countries are the only countries that are financially capable of dealing with the refugees. But they have to help with the issue. This doesn't mean they have to let refugees in, as we have provided. The alternative option is more effective and fulfills the obligation, if there is any, for the developed countries. And this is why we have successfully refuted all the points provided by the Conti. Thank you.
Perfect. Judge ready? Opponents ready? So my time will start now. So first of all, we'll quickly go over the framework. We're telling you that they forget the word "are" in the topic. Protein must defend existing policies within the status quo because the topic tells them to. And they're unable to advocate for any alternative, which is 048, which basically means that you should scrape that out of your full paper right now. And let's move on to their contentions one by one. First of all, they tell you about social contracts. Two responses. First, states are interdependent. Our opponents believe states only need to focus on its own national interest in international politics. However, this will not work in the real world. In fact, all states are interdependent. That's why states should adhere to promoting interests of humanity instead of only focusing on its own interests. Two, crime in the name of sovereignty. According to Karen Shaw, professor of political science at the University of Victoria, sovereignty and a belief in its necessarily have been responsible for incredible violences. History has taught us that emergence of nationalism has led to global catastrophes, both the First and Second World War, and for example, the Germany Holocaust in 1930s, all best illustrate the point that they're bringing out because sovereignty and nationalism is causing these crimes. Now let's move on to their second contention, their point about terrorism. We have four responses. First, low risk. According to Cato Institute, the risk of a refugee causing a terrorist attack on the U.S. is 1 in $3.6 billion. As reasonable people, we accept the amounts of risk baked into our daily lives. Two, the threat is inside. Refugees aren't the cause. According to Rosa Brooks, in 2005, terrorist attacks in London were carried out by British citizens. The Boston Marathon attack was perpetrated by U.S. citizens. Adding more border guards or keeping our refugees fleeing war and misery won't help when the threat is already inside. Three, terrorists won't use refugees. Refugees are never the only, not even the first choice for terrorists to attack. Terrorism is so well organized that it doesn't have to risk the refugee routes. ISIS has adequate financial resources to fly potential terrorists anywhere in South America, and they could make their way into the U.S. with other illegal immigrants. The chances of Homeland Security missing a handful of potential terrorists among 180 million temporary visitors are truly much greater than the odds of missing them among well-vetted refugees. Five, refugees, if not accepted by developed countries and integrated in society, are vulnerable to extremism. For example, the major refugee camps in Kenya have traditionally been recruiting grounds for terrorist groups such as ISIS, which basically means that refugees were the innocent civilians whose homelands are destroyed because of wars, and our opponents demonize them by depicting them as terrorists, which are perpetrating the terrorism and making them one of ISIS. Now let's move on to your point about trade-off. We actually have two responses. First of all, enough money. The total GDP of developed nation is $42 trillion, with $8.2 billion is 0.1% of total GDP. And developed countries have enough financial resources. They spend $50 billion on just foreign assistance. Two, resettlement cheap. Countries can resettle 4 million refugees for just $2 billion. Now let's move on to your talking about how they're good for how like refugees are a burden. We tell you that developed countries need workers and refugees can fill in the labor gap by increasing the global gains of 342 billion euros according to the World Bank. They don't even take jobs that others are less willing to take, and they can complement the local labor force, which basically means that refugees actually generate the money to the economy and doesn't waste the welfare. Additionally, groups like the American Immigration Council says that refugees have long given more to the welfare system than they take from it. In one estimate, refugees earn about $240 billion a year, pay about $90 billion in taxes, which basically means that they don't depend on welfare and they in fact generate for the economy. Let's answer to this 12 times cheaper, because that's the only reason they give for supporting developing countries is better. We tell you 3 responses. First, cost savings measures always risk people in order to save money, which basically means that on their side, healthcare, education are all worse. Cheaper isn't better. It's a worse life for the refugees where they live off with no adequate water, no healthcare, and no social welfare. 2, even if you say it's cheaper, developing countries don't have even land to hold the refugees. They're experiencing overcrowding issue that cannot be solved by any single aid. 3, developing countries is the worst option for refugees because we tell you that actually like the light exposure kills more than 200,000 people, and that's more than 97% of those affected live in developing world. 3rd, we tell you that answer to their aid. Actually in Hungary and Portugal all slice their contributions by 100% of foreign aid, and these foreign aids are not effective at all. Thus we urge a card ballot. Thank you.
Cross.
Oh yeah, sure.
Our time starts now. You just stated that developed countries have enough money to help its domestic poor people and help the refugees. Then, why are there still 10 million people domestically under extreme poverty line in America?
Okay, you can solve extreme poverty just by saying that because government has enough money, right? Extreme poverty exists in all countries, regardless of which side we're standing on. We can't solve this matter just because we're talking about the topic of refugees, which basically means that you are off topic. Now let's move on to our contention when talking about fight humanitarian crimes. How do you answer to the fact that restriction is causing doubt in borders where rape, torture, slave labor happens?
Well, we're providing an alternative option to prevent that serious issue from happening. We recognize that is terrible, and we're trying to do something to make up for it.
Could you tell me your alternative?
We have stated for multiple times our alternative option is
Developing countries and aid, right?
Yes, resettling, keeping the refugees in the neighboring developing countries, and having them stay there while giving them foreign aid and social support.
Okay, as a question, with currently developing countries being overcrowded with too much burden to take, and they're falling
Do
on
you have any evidence that developing countries are currently overcrowded?
Sorry, okay, in my rebuttal I clearly told you
But
that...
you did not give any evidence.
Okay, according to WHO, environmental hazards in the work and home, poor sanitation and hygiene kill 1.7 million
We're
people
saying
in developing
you have not
countries.
provided evidence on how overpopulation affects developing countries.
Okay, overpopulation is directly our third contention, right? We tell you that because it lacks space and land to even hold them, they don't have the capacity and
But
it's causing unhygienic water.
why do developing countries lack space and land? Do you recognize that there are more developing countries in the world than there are developed countries?
Okay, can I quickly answer a question? That's because, okay, that's the status quo, right? The fact is that developing countries are like a land. And the only solvency here is that concept providing you that developed countries should share the burden and take more land to hold refugees. You're not rebutting the fact. The fact is that they like a land to hold. Look at Jordan, look at Lebanon. And we're saying that we are the only solvency towards that by giving more developed countries capable of taking in refugees.
Okay,
So,
let me ask you a question.
Okay.
You said cheaper isn't better.
Yes.
But what is more important? Saving a larger number of refugees or saving a smaller number of refugees but guaranteeing a higher life quality?
Is it better that saving more refugees when they are left to die with unhygienic water and 40,000 people die because of cholera because it's a treatable disease while all happening in your pro side? Is
That
what
won't
you want to
happen
see?
with the
For more
alternative
people
option.
to take in your country and then let them die. Is that what you want to see?
That won't happen if we provide them with healthcare aid.
Okay, healthcare aid. We already told you that the aid has been slashed 95% in Sweden and 69% in Louisiana.
Yes,
How are we saying
which
that
exactly
aid
proves
is so
we're not
hard?
doing enough and we should do more to
Do you
alleviate the
have
crisis.
a card saying there's a trend of aid improving, or I can't buy your book? Because we have the cards telling you that aid is slashed so hard that they cannot even sustain.
But
right?
countries are also cutting the number of refugees they receive.
You're saying that you're cutting the refugees. Yeah, basically that's your process. That's why we have so much chaos.
Time.
Everyone ready? My time starts now. First, for clarification, our team doesn't have to defend all status quo. We only have to defend that restriction is bad. Oh, restriction is good. And restriction is not the cause of the problems in the status quo. We can solve the problem in the status quo with restrictions. The first clash, alternative. The opponent constantly mentions the poor condition in the camp, and most refugees are in the camp. So we have every reason to believe that to change the condition of the camp is the ultimate solution to the refugee crisis, as 85% of the refugees are living in developing countries. And making the conditions in the camp better is the way that we can provide to the most refugees. And you cannot take that amount of refugees into the developed country. And they have shown no evidence on how actually developing countries are lack of land. They're only based on assumption, and every evidence we have read in our case doesn't prove, hasn't shown that developing country have a lack of land in any way. And they accused of not showing the trend of countries not showing the trend of giving money. Well, countries does not show the trend of having more refugees either. It's not what the country want to do in this topic. It's what they should do. We think they should give aid to the developing country. The second clash is about the responsibility. The completely neglects the welfare money, which should belong to the 10 million domestic needy families, which are now the refugees, because the government of America have to resettle the refugees. These money are directly tapped from the 10 million families, which we have reason to believe that harms their life quality or even harm their life. The last clash I find is about terrorism. The evidence they gave are America and London, which are both countries that always had a restriction. So we have the reason to believe restriction is what keeps terrorists from entering that country. And look at the example we have given, France and Germany, who are open to refugees and are suffering from terrorist crisis. So we have the reason to believe refugees are the causes of the terrorism in both in the two countries I have mentioned. Due to these reasons, we urge a pro value. Thank you.
So it's a calm summary for 2 minutes. Everyone ready? Time starts now. Quickly go over all the key clashes in the previous day. First of all, let's talk about our first contention, which is about humanitarian crime. Our opponent's only response to that is that first, they do not have to defend the status quo. Second, their foreign aid will stop. First of all, we already told you expressly that in the resolution, the words are tell us that the pro side is defending status quo. And further, we're not only criticizing status quo, we're criticizing the overall ineffectiveness of restriction this thing itself, and we will prove it later. And that's why the A, denial of border, B, human trafficking, C, camp disaster, where the refugee live off of 0.5 USD per day, D, refugee generation, and E, LGBTI, all falls on our ground, and our impact cannot be further denied by our opponents in their final focus. And now moving on to the second point of obligation. Our opponent's only response to our obligation point is that these problems are not solely caused by developed countries. We never suggest that these problems will be solely caused by developed countries. We're just saying developed countries carry the major responsibility, while now 85% of the refugees are in developing countries. Those countries that never cause us problems are suffered the most, while developed countries that think they're receiving their benefits. We're presenting you three figures. First, 60% of Saudi Arabia arms are provided by US. 90% of sub-Saharan infrastructure was destroyed by EU countries. And most important of all, 79% of historical carbon emissions is caused by developed countries. When we talk about capability problems, Judge, bear in mind that developing countries overall have fewer and weaker social and economic structure compared to developed countries. While our opponents suggesting that those neighboring countries can't accommodate them, we already provided you a UNHCR card in our contention tree. It expressly state that the current problem in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey is caused by overpopulation as well as the over-intensiveness upon overall social welfare system, which means that overall the social impact our opponents mention about all towards our ground. And when we mention about the terrorism, Judge, we're not only telling you that only 1 out of 3.6 billion refugees could potentially be a terrorist. We're telling you in Paris that 4 out of 5 terrorists come from Belgium. Any local citizens could have as much threat as any refugee could possibly does. Shutting them out will only breed hatred in the next generation of those refugees and create the vicious cycle of more and more refugees destabilizing social order. Thank you.
Cross.